Dr. Cowan, welcome to the podcast. So happy to have you here. We are going to do a deep dive into some topics that my listeners probably have not learned a whole lot about. So it's wonderful to have you here to have this conversation about topics that are really important, but probably not well known. And I know I've been studying some new topics that I'm bringing guests on to the podcast and foreign to a lot of people. So hopefully you can simplify some things a little bit for us and help our understanding. But we're really excited to have you here today.
Okay, and please call me Tom, not Dr. Cowan.
I will do that. All right, Tom. Well, let's start by just giving so you've written a number of books and basically like a 3-part series, one with cardiovascular health, one kind of surrounding vaccines, and one about cancer and the new biology of water. And that's the one that I've been studying. And if you could just give us a brief overview of how you even got interested in that and how you came to understand the topics that you are covering in that book, because they're fascinating and like I said, really foreign to most people. So how did you become so interested in that topic?
Well, thanks for having me. And it's sort of an interesting question because I could also flip that around and say, I can't imagine if somebody is, calling themselves like a medical doctor, which I was, I trained medical doctor, why you wouldn't be interested in like what causes disease. I mean, it's to me, it would be weird if, because people came to me, should they be tested for cancer? Do they have cancer, or what should they do about cancer? And if I wasn't interested or didn't look into what this was about, I mean, to me, that would be bizarre. And the other thing about me is I have a long history, I would say, of not believing stuff because that's what they said in medical school. In fact, I would go so far as to say, this may sound strange to you maybe and your listeners, but even in 2019, I would put myself in this category. Most people in our country, including most medical doctors and most people who call themselves scientists, I would say are actually scientifically illiterate. And to me, that's a real problem. And I can give you an example of what I mean by that and how that relates to this issue with what causes cancer, if you want, because I think it'll help people understand what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
So, and I sometimes like to get who's ever interviewing me involved with questions. But let's say somebody, 18-year-old guy, he's sort of Asian-looking fellow. His parents are Caucasian-looking, and he's 18. And he's rummaging in his parents' closet, finds adoption papers. Didn't know he was adopted, but he always wondered because he didn't look. Goes to his parents and says, I just found these papers. Is true, And they say, yeah, we were waiting to tell you, and we got you from this orphanage in China, and we were just waiting to tell you. And everything is clear, the adoption papers, everything. So he goes to his friend and he says, man, I just found out I was adopted. It's a bit of a shock, and the friend says, so who are your real parents? And he says, I don't know, because I just found out. And then he says, well, if you can't tell me who your real parents are, then I don't believe you were adopted. Now, that would be weird, right? Like nobody would say that. But just as an example, I say to people, well, cancer is not a genetic disease. And they say, so what causes cancer then? That's the same as saying, so who's your real parents? The way of science is there's a claim made, right? Cancer is caused by mutations in genes, so-called oncogenes. We've spent, $10 billion, $10 trillion on that theory since the war on cancer in 1970. It doesn't matter if I or anybody else knows what causes cancer. That claim, that statement has to be proven on its own accord, just like the adoption thing, right? Now, when you look at that claim, and most people, if I say, for instance, lately I wrote a book, I would say, demonstrating that there's no such thing as a virus. They just made it up. So people say, I say there's no evidence that there's any virus. So people say, so what, why did I get sick? Again, that's like scientifically illiterate. If you think there's a virus that causes the flu or COVID or something, you have to prove that, right? And by the way, if something can't be proven, then it's a belief. And I have nothing against believing stuff. People believe in God and you can't prove it one way or another. That's fine, but you don't claim that that's science, and you don't lock people down over the whole world because you believe in God and this guy doesn't, right? That's just weird. So when you say, well, cancer is not a genetic disease, so one evidence that that's not true is if you take a normal cell and a cancer cell and you transplant the nucleus where they say the genes are, and you transplant a nucleus from a cancer cell into a healthy cytoplasm, the progeny are normal. And if you take a normal cell, take that nucleus and put it into a cancerous cytoplasm, the progeny have what they call cancer cells. Now, that tells you that the location of the problem, right, is not in the nucleus, period. So once you know that, and if you say that the genes are on the DNA and that's in the nucleus, which they do, you know that that can't be the problem with cancer. So already we've disproven that. And by the way, another tenet of science is when you prove something is false, that theory is done. I mean, that's obvious. If you prove you were not adopted, then you don't go and say, well, the reason you look like your parents is because you were not adopted, right? That's like ridiculous. But that's what we do. We keep going back to disproven theories, adding one so-called principle on top of another one until we don't remember the original assumption or principle was disproven. And that's what happened with cancer.
Yeah. And, it sounds good in theory until you have about 100 mutations in the same person. And where are these coming from? And how did the mutations get there is the main question. And my listeners know that, or my regular listeners know that my mom just died of complications of cancer treatment, chemotherapy, mainly a couple of months ago. And after she was diagnosed, the very first thing, like I went to a lot of her appointments, and the very first thing they wanted to do was do genetic testing. I have two sisters, so that me and my sisters could know genetically, if we have these mutations. And I was just like, and I had, read Dr. Seyfried's book by then. I was in the midst of reading your book, and I'm just thinking, oh, this is just so backward. But yeah, it's the cytoplasm. And I didn't come to that realization until I read your book, and I had to read it a couple of times to really get the understanding and to study the whole concept of the water and the exclusion zone water, which we'll get into, but it's really fascinating. And like you said, once you understand that, you'd think it would be empowering and the whole world would want to know and start to look at it. But, here we are years later and hardly anyone knows about this research.
Yeah, well, right. And let me just go through another thing, because again, my whole career is based on examining assumptions. And the problem is we don't even realize when we're making an assumption. That's a problem. So let me walk you through another one, which I didn't appreciate when I wrote this book. But if I asked you, what is a human being made of, what would you say?
You would say 70% water and cells but
Right.
it would be basically water, mostly water. And that's, a third grader could probably tell you that.
And cells, right?
Right.
All living things, animals, plants, are made of cells. Now, let me walk you through something here. So if somebody asked me this question, what is a human being made of? I would say a head, ears, eyes, arms, legs, chest, belly button, and a few other things. And then somebody would say, well, how do you know that, Tom? I would say, well, because I look and everybody I've ever seen says that, and you can show it right there in person. And by the way, every scientific discipline, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, et cetera, says there's cells, says there's heads and arms and legs, et cetera. Nobody disagrees with that. So for those reasons, I think that's true. You agree with that? Okay. They say, what's underneath your chest, for instance? Well, I got a heart and a lung, and some under the abdomen is the liver and pancreas, et cetera. So again, the question, how do I know that? Because I can't see them, but I was an ER doctor for a while. So I've seen people like shot and bayoneted and stabbed, and I could see their liver and I could see their heart. I can also see it in an ultrasound and a CT scan and an X-ray. And you could ask the question, how do you know that getting shot in the stomach doesn't make your liver appear in your abdomen? And I would say, well, I don't really know that for sure, because if you don't do that, it's hard to see it. But I don't think that's possible, right? It's too big and it's too complicated. And by the way, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, everybody thought there was organs, heart, liver. In fact, they put a lot of stock in them because they said your problem is the energy flow through these organs. Now, let's take a liver, for example. What is a liver made of? Everybody says liver cells. You ever seen a liver cell in an intact liver?
I haven't. No.
Neither have I. And I can assure you nobody else has either. So how do you do it? Because we forgot that the way you look for something determines what you find. And by the way, we know that if you take bacteria and you put them in a toxic environment, they form spore forms. In other words, they form compartments. So the way you find a liver cell is you take a piece of it out of a person. First of all, you poison them with some chemical so they don't feel it, called anesthesia. Then you put toxic dyes on it. Then you put it in a microscope, and then you see these compartments. Now, you don't actually know that they were there in the intact liver while it was living, because all those things form lines in the slide. And since you can't see it, you don't really know that it's there. And interestingly, nobody thought there were cells making up your liver. Now, why would you break your liver, a homogeneous organ, up into little cubicles like an office building, right? Doesn't make any sense. It's harder to communicate, harder for material to be passed from one side to the other, et cetera. And by the way, somebody came up with that theory in about 1850, a guy named Rudolf Virchow. And everybody said at the time, this is ridiculous. And he did it because he saw an onion cell and when he dissected an onion. Therefore, your liver is made of cells. And so I have serious questions whether there's cells in your liver when you're alive, or I would at least say it's unproven. Now, here's why this is important. Let's just imagine you have a homogeneous liver made of this organized water that you're talking about, and regularly it has to clean itself, right? Because every organ does. And so it does that by making compartments at the periphery to get rid of toxic stuff. And that happens all the time. And then you make a new liver, and then you get rid of it. And then you put more poisons into the liver, and it increases the amount of cells that it makes. And they're all misshapen and have funny number of chromosomes, and they all have, it doesn't look like a normal cell. Now, we call that a tumor, but that's the same thing. Like if I dumped a whole bunch of garbage in your house, what would you do?
Rid of it.
Put it in bags, right? That's what your body does. You dump some garbage in your house, especially in the water, your body puts it in bags called tumors.
Okay.
The tumor is not a disease. That's the message here. The tumor is the therapy for dumping garbage in your house. Now, how do I know that? Because they say that the tumor is growing cells, right? And they're going to kill it with chemo and all that. Now, when you look at these cells, they're not normal cells. They're all misshapen and got weird number of chromosomes, and they don't have boundaries like they're supposed to. if I told you, Shauna, I have this car, and I took it to the dump and I smashed it and the steering wheel's in the back seat and the brakes lines are cut and it's all messed up. But believe me, it runs twice as fast as a normal car. You would say, I don't think I believe you. But they just told you, you got this cell. It doesn't work right. It's got weird boundaries, misshapen, can't attach to the spindle. But trust me, it grows twice as fast as a normal cell. I don't buy it. And then they say that this cell swims through the blood and goes from your breast to your liver. Just like if you put garbage in your house, you put it in the basement, right? And then you put it in the garage, and then you put it in the spare bedroom, and then you put it in the kitchen, and then you put it in the bedroom, and then you have to move because your house is full of garbage. It doesn't swim or crawl from your basement to your bedroom any more than the tumor crawls from your breast to your liver, called a so-called metastases. And how do I know that? You go to the doctor, he says, you got a tumor in your breast. If you don't take it out, it's going to spread to your liver. How does it get there? It goes through the bloodstream. Can you show it to me in the bloodstream? No. Why not? Because we can't find it in the bloodstream. Well, how do you know it's there? Well, how else did it get from the breast to the liver? Right.
They say the lymph.
Yeah, the lymph. So show it to me in the lymph. They can't find it in the lymph. So how do they know that? My point is that is a theory and it's disproven. And yet they take your breast off, they take your prostate off, they poison growing cells with toxic stuff to keep the cells from growing. And there's no way those cells can grow. No way. Right. They're just bags of poison. And here's the take-home message. That bag of poison is your body's wise therapeutic attempt to keep it out of your general circulation and general life. Yeah. Just like if you put garbage in your house, you don't just leave it around your house. You put it in bags, you put it in a curb, you put it in cans, you take it out to the curb. And the reason this is so important is every therapy that's ever worked, Gerson therapy, fasting, coffee enemas, don't eat any sugar, all that stuff works because it stops poisoning the person and they can take the garbage out faster.
Interesting way to look at it and think about, because you're just told it just appears. Cancer just happens. Like it just happens to you. So the $1 million question, where did the bags and the garbage and the tumors come from?
From poisoning yourself.
Right. And let's talk about how and there's many poisons that we're surrounded
There's emotional, psychological, glyphosate, crappy food, EMFs, you could make his list as long as your arm.
Right. Yeah. Especially since 2020, when we really exposed you.
Vaccines, they're a major source of people inject themselves with poisons. One of the things they're dealing with now after the COVID shots is turbo cancer.
Right. And I think that's what happened to my mom, because she had a scan that was normal in April, and in July she had tumors everywhere.
Right. So how does that happen? So you take these deadly and unknown, right? We don't even know what's in there, electronic, God knows what stuff, and you inject it into the people, and next thing you know, their body forms it into an aggressive tumor. And the doctors say, well, I don't know what happened. What must be your genetic. Like you were going on 70 years with the same genes, allegedly, and all of a sudden the genes got wonky and they decided to kill you. By the way, speaking of what's proven, they say, the whole principle of genetics is genes code for proteins, right? That's how it works. Do you know that we have 200,000 proteins and about 10,000 genes? So apparently geneticists don't know arithmetic, because that means there's 190,000 that are not coded for by genes. And by the way, we know for absolute sure that every tissue in your body has a different DNA and it changes all the time. So if somebody says, hey, you have a mutation, that's because it's changing all the time. There is no mutations. That's just the norm. It's just a chemical which does nothing, doesn't code for proteins. It's not the basis of heredity. And we know that for sure. You can take a worm, you can cut off their head, expose it to a sound field, and get it to grow back no heads, one head, or two heads, just by exposing it to different vibrations. And interestingly, the progeny of the ones with two heads have two heads, and the ones with one head have one head, proving that the hereditary influence is not even in the worm. Just like if I gave you a bunch of bricks and 2x4s and screws and nails, said, here, make a house. You say, where's the blueprint for the house? Well, it's in the bricks. So you go looking for the bricks. So we spent 60 years looking through the bricks for the blueprint for the house. And you know what? It's not there. It's in the mind of the architect. And without the mind of the architect, you can't make a house. And without the mind of something, I don't know, God maybe, you can't make a living thing. It's in the field. And they keep looking for it's this molecule, that molecule, whatever. It's not there.
Makes sense. Yeah. And when you think about it that way, it's like cancer is terrifying for anybody who gets that diagnosis. But when you think about it in these terms and how it actually is developing and not spreading how we think it is, it's not as scary. I mean, I don't want to downplay it, but it just when things start to click and make sense, I think if we can embrace all of the ideas, then and we'll start talking about some of the alternative treatments too. I think it's not like when I'm talking to you and you're explaining this to me, it's not as scary as I think we make it out to be.
It's not scary.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I have a good friend, a doctor, who says, and appropriately so, there's only one disease, and that's called victim consciousness. In other words, you didn't do anything. You're a victim of your genes. You didn't do anything. It's not that shot. It's not what you ate. It's not your relationship that sucks. It's not that you suck down glyphosate food all the time. It's none of that you never get out in the sun, that you have a cell phone on your body, 24 hours a day and sleep with it next to your head. It's none of that. It's just genetics. Yep. Bad luck.
Right. And I know
you're a victim.
Right.
And once you stop playing the victim role, like in our clinic, so we started a clinic, the new biology clinic, and we treat, we help people with this. The last 3 people with stage 4 cancer, they're all fine now.
That's amazing.
Because once you see that this is fundamentally your body's healing attempt, and you may need to help it, you may need to stop eating crap all the time and actually not have toxic relationships in your life, and there's a whole long list of things. It goes away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I have a lot of people in my life who are like, Shanna, I want to feel like you do from day to day. I'm like, well, you need to live like me. You can't.
Yeah, you need to
think that. You have to put it in play and actually,
do something.
Yes, do something about it. So, well, let's talk about the structured water. If you could explain that to us, because that's a new concept on the podcast and something that I've learned about in the last several months that, like I said, was very foreign to me. And it took me a while to wrap my head around it. And, the whole exclusion zone and if we can, in the simple terms, if you can explain that to us and how that's coming into play with, how cancer is developing and our overall health and how important that concept is to understand.
So somewhere around 3rd grade, or I don't know exactly, in what are properly called indoctrination camps, sometimes called schools, but they're not schools, actually. They're indoctrination camps. They tell us that matter has three forms: solid, liquid, gas, right? So you have copper, and there's like physical solid copper, and then molten or liquid copper, or you could get it to really high temperatures and it's gaseous copper, right? And there's no intermediate stages. It goes from a solid to a liquid, then to a gas. There's not like gas and a half or something. Same with water: ice, water, steam. So here I am, medical school, and they say, there's three phases of matter. They don't tell us that anymore because they figure we all knew that. And your body is 70% water in the tissues, or they call them cells. 99.9% of the quote molecules, which by the way don't exist either, are water molecules. Okay, so that's what I know. So the first thing I think is, doesn't feel like I'm sloshing around. I said, what phase is it in? Well, it's not ice, right? Because that's weird. It's not steam, so it's got to be liquid. Okay, so you would think if you have bags of liquid, you would like squish around. Anyways, so that's weird. But then, again, I'm ER doctor. People get shot. You know how many times I saw water squirting out of people? Never. So I said, "Where's the water?" Well, it's in the tissues. I said, "Yeah, but you ripped open the liver and there's no water. You say it's 70% water. There's no water in there." Yeah, well, that's because it's hiding like this.
Yeah.
Like, all right. So I asked people, so Jello, Jello, right? You don't probably eat it, but you know what it is. 97% water, right? What phase is that in?
None.
It's not ice. It's not liquid. It's not steam. And if you bayonet it or poke it with a pin, nothing squirts out. And obviously, you can prove by using spectrophotometry that the bond angles, which defines this phase, is different than ice and water, clearly. So there's a fourth phase of water, and only water, not copper, not gold, nothing else. And all of the water in our tissues, in our bodies, besides like blood or urine, is in this gel phase. And if it isn't, that's what's called sick. Now, here's what's interesting. If you ask your doctor, so is cancer, is their problem is my water isn't right? You say, "Oh, that's ridiculous. I don't know where you got that from." And you say, "Okay, how do you diagnose cancer?" "Well, we do an MRI and we see what, if there's a tumor there." What is the MRI measuring? Now, the doctors, because he's illiterate about science, doesn't know. He doesn't know what it's measuring. He just knows the radiologist says there's a tumor. The MRI measures the bond angles of the water.
Okay.
And so if your water goes from a gel to a puddle, or to it hardens, so instead of being like this, it's all twisted up, it sends out a different signal, and then the thing integrates it in the computer, and it shows up as a different color, which the radiologist says, "Yeah, that's wrong." And so that's what we call a tumor. Or if you got a knee and your knee is not right, and then you got eventually too much swelling in the knee, doctor sticks a needle in and he draws out all this liquid. What happened is your knee, which is cushioned by this gel, two gels, has liquefied for whatever reason. And so now you have water called bulk water, and that's not right. And that's why that's the disease. Your body is not able to maintain this proper gel phase, and that's what we call a disease. Now, the importance of this is, when there's tissue that has a charge, right? All of our organs, all of our tissues are charged. That's what we call life. Now, here again, go to your doctor and say, "I heard this guy Cowan," he sounds like an idiot to me, but he said that if I don't have healthy electrical flow through my organs, then I'm sick. That's ridiculous. All right. So I want to know if my brain works well or if I'm dead. So what are you going to do? Well, I'll do an EEG. What does that measure? The electrical flow through your brain. And if you don't have an electrical flow through your brain, we call you dead.
Right.
And you just told me that the electrical flow is not the thing that makes you alive or not. Or what, I want to know if my heart is okay. Can you help me with it? Yeah, I can do an EKG, right? Everybody knows what that is. What is it measuring? The electrical activity of your heart. See whether you had a heart attack or not. What about if my muscles, I have muscular dystrophy or MS. So I want to know if my muscle. So they do an EMG, they measure the electrical resistance of your muscles. And then they tell you that the electrical charge isn't the determinant of your health, which is bizarre. Anyways, the question, where does this electrical charge come from? It comes from the water is a dipole, which means it's basically it has the ability to maintain a charge. And it does that by separating things like sodium and potassium. And essentially, we say there's a sodium potassium pump in the membrane, but that's ridiculous because they take the membrane off and the sodium potassium is the same. It has nothing to do with the membrane. And that creates a charge. So if you don't have proper gel phase water, then you lose your charge and you're a dead battery, and then you're going to get sick, and then you're going to have tumors or something else. Now, the other thing is your lung tissue is this gel, right? Like a Jello. Now, here's a question. If you had a Jello and you put some poison grapes in it, and I said, can you get them out of the Jello? What would you do?
Other than, I mean, you'd have to eat the Jello to get the grapes out, or you'd have to dissect them out, or they'd just stay stuck in there, I would suppose.
How about this? You could melt the Jello and then let it run and then reconstitute the Jello afterwards without the grapes. That would work, right? Okay, so person puts debris in their lungs, like chemtrails and all the rest of it, and they got Jello with debris in their lungs. The body says, I got to get that debris out of there because it's nasty and interfering with the charge. So you get a fever to melt the gels, and then you make mucus to get it out, and then you sneeze and cough it out, and then you reconstitute a healthy gel. That's called healing. Now, the problem is you breathe in this nasty stuff, and you get stuff in your lungs, and then you have a fever and to melt the gels, and you start coughing, and you go to the doctor, and because they have no clue how any of this works, they say, oh, you got bronchitis. It's a disease. So we're going to give you stuff to stop the mucus from coming out.
Or they'll say, take Tylenol and ibuprofen to suppress your fever.
Right. And then that stuff stays in your lungs, right? Because you stopped it from coming out. And you do that twice a year for 20 years. That's what most people do, especially smokers, right? They put debris in and then they try to get it out twice a year. They go to the doctor and get it stopped. And then 20 years later, they have a bag of debris in their lungs called lung cancer. And they say, see, it's genetic. No, it's not. It's you put nasty shit in your lungs and somebody stopped you from getting it out. And so it built up. Just like if I put garbage in your house and somebody locked the door so you couldn't get the garbage out to the curb, you'd end up with a house full of garbage. This is not like rocket science.
Right.
And that's why people for millennia, if you were sick, they put you in a sweat lodge or they gave you herbs to cough it out. And so the water is the vehicle for this. And that's how we diagnose illness. That's how we diagnose cancer. You've got poison grapes in your water, and they can't get out because you keep stopping it. That's all there is to it.
And why 200 years ago, these things weren't manifesting like they are.
Yeah, because people got them out.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that these so-called illnesses, that's the biggest psyop in medicine of all, is what we call illnesses. Every single one of them, dementia, cancer, bronchitis, the flu, measles is not a disease. It's not a distinct entity. It's your body's attempt to heal. And if you don't know that, you can't heal anything,
Right.
period.
So once the cancer has already developed, like somebody goes and they get stage 3, stage 4, what are the best modalities to then start to heal from it? Would you induce a fever somehow, or are there other things that you are recommending or that you talk about as, best modalities to give them the best fighting chance? Because as we know, chemo, radiation are just going to knock your immune. They do the exact opposite of helping your immune system to overcome this and heal.
So number one is we don't have an immune system.
Oh, okay.
They made that up to make you think that there was viruses. So here's the way science works these days. They have people who are sick, right? You don't know why. And so they make a theory up that it's caused by these invisible particles, which, by the way, up until as of today, have never been found in any fluid or tissue of a sick person. And I know that for 100% sure.
Okay.
So, right? So the original theory was if you were exposed to somebody who had this particle, you would be sick. Now, they quickly falsified that theory because a lot of people are around people who have measles or the flu, and some seem to get sick and most people don't, right? So they falsified the theory. So there's two options you have. You could go back and say, well, that theory was wrong. So I'm going to start over. There are no particles. Or you can make up another concept or theory to keep the story going. So why don't everybody get sick? Because you have an immune system that keeps you from getting sick. In other words, and by the way, this immune system is very clever because that's why you only get things once in your life, like measles, right? And works through antibodies. So I learned that if you make antibodies, you're immune for life, right? Everybody knows that. You get measles, you get the virus, you get over it, you make antibodies, you're immune for life. Except if you have the flu, because then you get it again next year because the antibodies don't work. And then 1984, I just graduated medical school. I'm walking down the street and I see Robert Gallo on the television, and he announced, we found the cause of AIDS. What is it? It's a virus called HIV. How does he know that HIV causes AIDS? Because they found antibodies in some people with AIDS. In other words, if you have antibodies to the virus, that means the virus is going to kill you. So I said to the guy I was walking with, wait a minute, I spent 4 years learning that if I have antibodies, then I'm immune.
Right.
And this guy just told me that if I have antibodies to HIV, that means the virus is going to kill me. And I thought, who changed the rules?
Right. Overnight.
Overnight, they just changed, no explanation. Now, here's another question. Is it true that if you only get something once in your life, that's because you have immunity to it?
If it's natural immunity.
Like, so if you get hit by lightning once, that's because you're immune to lightning.
Let's hope I don't get hit by lightning.
98% of people get hit by lightning once.
Right.
About 80% of the people get divorced. They get divorced once. That's because they have immunity to divorce. Except if they do something stupid like have an affair, and then they lose their immunity and then they get another divorce. And the point is, antibodies have nothing to do with immunity. And there's no such thing as autoimmune disease. And I know that for sure, because if you go looking for a study that says an antibody causes symptoms, like if you take antibodies, inject them into an animal or a person, they never cause any trouble. So the whole theory of autoimmune disease is bullshit, pure BS. The reason you make antibodies is to repair your tissue. So that if you're sick, like you have AIDS because you've been poisoned and a whole lot of other things, you make more antibodies to try to help yourself. There is nothing but your body trying to heal you. Anything else is victim consciousness. So once you realize that, the answer to the question, what do we do with people who have cancer? We do the same thing we do with if you have the flu or anything else. We hear your story. In other words, what happened to you? Well, I was fine, and then I took this COVID shot, and then 3 months later, I've got this cancer. Or I've been stressed and eating crap for my whole life, and then I developed this breast cancer. And it happened right after I got divorced from my husband, and my child left me, or whatever. And those are two entirely different situations, right? The first one, you need to detoxify from that COVID shot. The second one, you need to look at the emotional repercussions of the divorce and the loss of your child and the lifestyle that you've been leading. And to say that you should treat them the same is an absolute recipe for failure. They're not the same disease. Just like you see people with rheumatoid arthritis, so-called. One of them is a vegan, so they never eat any collagen, so their joints deteriorate, and they call it rheumatoid arthritis. The next has never exercised, so their joints are weak. And you don't treat them the same. And only in the medicine that we do we say, no, it's rheumatoid arthritis, that's a separate disease, so everybody gets Enbrel. It's absolute madness.
I'm in agreement with you because I have two kids who have undergone some pretty big health issues, and one autoimmune issue of ulcerative colitis. And I felt from the get-go like this is not his immune system. Like he was fine one week and now he's not. Like how? And anyway, we went through this whole ordeal to get him well. And I've worked with people, many people. Now there's more and an explosion of autoimmune. They're like, well, how do I cure this? Like, how come there's no answer for me? And it's, well, because there's no one way to treat any one autoimmune illness. And it's just a manifestation of so many underlying issues. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion to figure out,
but there's no autoimmune disease.
Right. And I've said that about my son. I'm like, and he still says it. He's 18 and he still says to me, well, there's something wrong with my immune system. Like, no. Get that out of your head. There is no,
right.
You cannot have a faulty autoimmune system. And that, he probably heard that somewhere along the way from one of his doctors. And we don't know, that's always, we don't know why this happened, but it's lifelong. That's always their answer to everything. And we're going to pump you full of, toxins that are classified as chemotherapy, even though you're 11 years old. It's like, oh my gosh.
But here's the proof. Here's the proof of that. The definition of an autoimmune disease like ulcerative colitis or rheumatoid arthritis is you have an antibody attacking your tissue, right? That's the definition. If you go looking for people diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis and say, first question, what percentage of them have antibodies? Should be 100%, right? That's the whole point. Turns out 60% have antibodies and the other 40% don't. So what you said, I said, so what is that? Like, you just told me that if you don't have antibodies, you don't have this disease. Well, that's non-antibody rheumatoid arthritis. That's like, I go to my outside and I have these little animals that go bark, bark, bark like that. They have feathers. Then I have the other ones that go meow. And those are non-feathered chickens.
Right. Yeah, you could say that about any disease, right?
Right. I mean, it was like measles. So how do you know somebody has measles? Though they have a rash and a fever. Well, there's 50 other diseases that have rash. So no, they have Koplik spots, these white spots in their cheeks. So then I go looking. Turns out 40% of children who they're told have measles don't have Koplik spots. I said, wait a minute, you just told me that that's how you know. Well, yeah, but those are non-Koplik spot measles. It's like, wait a minute, this is bullshit.
Right.
So,
I know. And when you really just stop and think about it, there's just so many questions that should be going through your mind. But You just assume.
Right. And
Going to
ask your
doctor.
doctor,
Yes, yes.
show me a
Oh,
study that shows that you take antibodies and expose them to another person and it causes ulcerative colitis. And I know for a fact there is no study. And if there's no study, then on what basis are you saying that it's the antibodies that are causing the disease? And I can tell you there is no basis for that.
right,
Somebody poisoned him, and then he's trying to get it out by flushing it out through his bowels.
right.
That's it. That's all there is to it.
Exactly. Well, I'd like to turn the conversation to deuterium depleted water because I've been learning about that too. And again, I didn't even know that this existed. And I know you wrote a lot about that in your book. And, when you think about water, you think of H2O, but there's also this deuterium depleted water. And we can point to Dr. Jerry Pollack's research that shows a lot of this, but this was a concept that was like jaw dropping to me. I'm like, wait, there's different types of water, and deuterium water is heavier and it's more toxic in large amounts. And a lot of what is happening, like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a lot of what is making the cytoplasm more toxic. But can you talk about what deuterium depleted or deuterium first, what deuterium is, the deuterium water, and then, what makes the levels of it either increase or decrease, and how does that relate to disease?
Right. And so I must say, I think a little differently than when I wrote the book, because when I wrote the book, I was under the misconception, two things. One, there was such a thing as an atom, which there isn't. And two, that there were isotopes of atom, which means different variations. There's always variance, right? So if you always use variance when something isn't like what you think. And number three, there's three misconceptions. I thought water was made of H2O. It isn't. You can put it through an electrical process and generate oxygen and hydrogen, but that doesn't mean that water is water. Now, deuterium-rich water is heavy water. How do you know that? Because if you have a bag of H2O, so-called, or a bag of D2O, which is called an isotope of hydrogen, which means it has a neutron where hydrogen doesn't have one. But that's actually not the way it works, but it's a way to communicate that. What really it is impure heavy water. Okay. And if you can hold it in one hand, and this water, same amount of water, will be heavier. Now, when you make a living structure, which is supposed to be what Marcel Vogel called a mesophase, or a living crystal. It's like quartz, but made of water instead of silica. So it's a fluid crystal. But when you're using heavy water to make this crystal, let's say the crystal is like this, you distort it and it gets like this. That's just a way to see it. And that doesn't generate the charge. It doesn't separate things the way they're supposed to be separated, and you've got a dead battery. And so your energy generation, if your body is made of too much of this heavy water, is weak. So your battery starts running down, and then you get diabetes, and you get all kinds of neuropathies, and you eventually get cancer because you can't generate a charge. You can't distribute things in the way they're supposed to be distributed. And just like a battery, the weaker the charge, eventually the battery's dead. So one of the things you can do, deuterium, you can get very light water, which is water that has very little of this deuterium in it. And it's usually separated by deuterium rich water freezes before regular water. So if you put like a jar of water in a freezer, it'll get like a sheen of ice on it. And if you scrape the ice off, the part that was left would be lower in deuterium. Not by much, but that's how they make it. And so most people have about 140 parts per million of so-called deuterium. And if you get up to 150, your tissues start having more and more trouble generating this charge. And you can drink very light water, deuterium depleted water, and bring it back down to like 130, and your charge will start happening more and more. You'll get healthier, more metabolically active. You'll generate more energy. And the studies say that you'll live 2 to 3 times as long if you have cancer, if you drink deuterium depleted water and eat a low carbohydrate diet, because fats don't have deuterium and carbohydrates do.
Yeah, interesting. I was going to have you tie that in and why it's important to recognize that, our high carbohydrate, ultra processed diet is doing nothing but making, I mean, we know that this makes us toxic, but that's one of the reasons why.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that, because one of the things we don't realize is we generate the water through metabolism that we have in our body. And anybody can just look at the equations of the Krebs site, glucose plus oxygen makes carbon dioxide and water. We don't actually even need to drink water because we make water in our bodies through metabolizing food. Metabolizing fats generates more water and cleaner water than from carbohydrates, because the glucose is a simpler molecule and it can have this deuterium rich water in it, whereas fats can't.
Yeah, so it's more the structure of the fats versus the carbs that is
Right.
in the deuterium. Yeah. Yeah. So when it comes to, people are probably like, what are they, what are they talking about? I think overall concept is just to live a lifestyle, eat foods that are going to keep you naturally lower in the deuterium, overall. Is there anything else other than the carbs versus fats, and then drinking more purified water, or drinking reverse osmosis filtered water? I know spring water is probably the best form, the lowest deuterium. Is there anything else that will naturally lower deuterium in the body so that you don't have the toxic effects from it?
The only way to lower deuterium is through drinking manufactured deuterium depleted water and eating a ketogenic type of diet. Nothing else works,
Okay.
period.
Okay.
Like,
That's good to know.
and even there's some problems with reverse osmosis. There's problems with all those, but this is something that you probably need some guidance with.
Yeah, we're just scratching the surface on a lot, a lot of big topics here, but just to expose people to,
Right. I mean, people who are trying to and I didn't mean you need guidance, but I mean,
no, I
people
know. Yeah.
they have cancer or something, they
Right.
shouldn't just like, oh, well, I'm going to drink spring water and hope that
That's
lowers
it.
my deuterium, because it won't.
Mhm. Yes. Yeah, but some of these concepts are just so profound. It's just good to at least expose people and make it known to them. But one more thing I'd love to ask you about, and then we'll start closing out. What about NADH as a natural it's naturally found in the body. But what are your thoughts on that as a supplement if somebody is diagnosed with cancer, and trying to use that to, increase the production of, or the, increase mitochondria workload overall, and the cellular water, and where does that come into play?
I mean, so generally speaking, I don't like to use like chemicals or manufactured stuff. Like if I'm going to eat food, I'm going to eat carrots and grass-fed beef, etc. But so generally, we make a substance called ATP in the mitochondria. Now, some people will tell you that ATP is the energy currency of the body, but it's not. That's absolutely for sure. What it does is, so when you have Jello, you have gelatin, proteins, and water. You put Jello, powdered Jello in water, nothing happens, right? Then you heat it, and that unfolds the proteins, and then they can interact with water, and then when it cools, it forms Jello. Now, we can't use heat because we don't have like Bunsen burners in our body. So, so the body has an ingenious system of the proteins in our tissues. The ATP attaches to the ends of them and unfolds them. Then the water can interact with the proteins and form this liquid crystal like I talked about. And NADH increases the ability of your mitochondria to generate ATP, which then helps you make this unfold the proteins, which helps you structure the water, which generates the energy, which is the problem, the charge. So I have seen people and used a lot of NADH myself in my practice because it helped them structure their water through this ATP based mechanism. And without ATP, you can't unfold the protein, so you can't make Jello.
Gotcha.
And
Yeah. Go back
then
and
you
listen to
gotta
that a couple times because I've heard you talk about that, and I like went back. I'm like, okay, listen to that again because it's very profound. I mean, it's like you just kind of rattle that off in a minute, but it's like, whoa, if you grasp that, that is a huge concept to think about.
Yeah, but if you think of it with Jello, it doesn't work if you don't heat up the solution.
Mhm.
And that's because proteins need to be in a certain configuration in order to be like it's just like building your house. You have to have the 2x4s in the right angle, or you just can't put them anywhere. So it's the ATP binding with them that makes them form the lattice or the grid, which can then accept the water and turn it into this gel, which is what you're made of.
Yeah, the human,
Otherwise, you're a puddle.
right?
And if you're a puddle, you don't work right.
Yes, and when we're talking about structured water, again, I'm sure it's a foreign concept to a lot of people, but it's mind-boggling what the human body is doing all, every second of that just while we sit here. It's just amazing and mind-boggling. And if you can wrap your head around some of the concepts that we talked about today, like we said, like things aren't so scary, things aren't so confusing. We can learn how to nourish and heal the body rather than deplete it and keep running it down. And we haven't even really talked about so many other things like EMF and exposure to other toxins that are just, again, that's depleting. That, and correct me if I'm wrong, like EMF, that's going to increase deuterium in the body, correct? Or is
No.
I incorrect on that? Okay. What is
But
the EMF like? Why is that so toxic to our cells?
so there's a very easy and elegant experiment from Jerry Pollack that describes this. So the reason that blood circulates in the body is because all of the gels are negatively charged. So here's the way to see this. Imagine a beaker of water, right? And you suspend a horizontal hydrophilic, meaning it connects with water, tube in this beaker of water, right? Got me? Now, because of the interaction of the water and the tube, it will form a gel layer on the inside of the tube, which is negatively charged. That's just the nature of the gels. That means the positive charge goes into the liquid water in the middle of the tube. And that positive charges essentially repel each other and start the water moving. And you can measure the velocity of the water in that tube. Okay. It's going really fast or not so fast or whatever. So there's nothing moving the water except this separation of charges. Now, you can take that beaker and put it in a lead box and the water stops moving. And you shine the sun on it and it starts moving really fast because the sun increases the gel formation, right? And that separates the charges and gets the water moving. You can put the beaker on the earth and that makes the water move faster. So now you know why it's good to get out in the sun with your bare feet on the ground, called earthing, okay? Then you can put your hands on the beaker, laying on of hands. Makes the water move faster because there's something coming from you that charges up the water. Then you can put your dog next to it, at least most dogs, and it'll move faster, right? So you know that the way we structure the water and the flow is because of the interaction of proteins, which we have, water, which we have, and the sun and the earth and other living beings, etc. Now, here's the hooker. You lean your cell phone next to the beaker, lean it on the beaker, the water stops moving.
Yeah.
Why? Because these are radiation emitting devices that destructure the water. So they prevent it from separating the charges, no separation of charges, no flow. And so you wonder why you have high blood pressure and you keep your cell phone in your pocket all day, which is inhibiting your flow. And so your body clamps down on the tubes to keep the blood moving, and that's called high blood pressure. Or a woman sticks their cell phone in their bra and walks around all day. A lot of people do that, and they get a tumor in their breast because they've destructured the water and it builds up poisons. And that's what I mean. That the way to treat that situation is not chemotherapy. It's throw away your cell phone.
Right. Right. Yeah, we've just gotten so far away from living how humans are meant to live that,
Right.
yeah, go back to the basics. My husband always laughs at me, like I'll go sit out anytime I can, like I'll go sit out and work with my feet on the ground. And he's like, oh, there she goes again. And I put my blue light blocking glasses on at night to try
Right.
to keep my circadian rhythm on check. But hey, whatever makes me feel good and sleep well and heal and
Yes.
keep me somewhat, human, how we're meant to be. So, well, in closing, last question. I know we're over for time here, but I think it's an important one, and one that I am really wondering about and wanted to get your thoughts on was screening for cancer, because a lot of these modalities for screening, like I know myself, my husband's always like, oh, you should go and get a mammogram, or you should go get it. I'm like, I don't know, like it's so toxic. And, a lot of these things are exposing us to radiation and things that increase the risk of cancer. So any tips on, cancer screening and recommendations?
There's no evidence that screening for cancer does any good for any person ever. Period. Nothing.
Sure.
It doesn't work. The best they can say is if you screen for breast cancer, you find it 3 years earlier than if you just waited until you had a lump, and you live 2.5 years longer,
Kind of a
which
lot.
means you, which is how they
Worse off.
bamboozle you into thinking. So if you didn't do anything, you would have lived 5 years, right? 3 years and then a lump and then 2 years. If you screen for cancer, you live 4.5 years because you had 2.5 years of, 4.5 years of misery,
Right.
because they'd be treating you and cutting your breast off and chemotherapy and hormone blockers, and it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because of the reasons I said earlier. It doesn't even, there is no metastases. The cancer cells are not swimming through your blood. It's this story of the DNA, like the heroic DNA. It's like, I don't know if you're old enough to remember, there was a movie called Free Willy about this whale.
Yeah.
So the whale was in captivity, and everybody in the movie theater said, Free Willy, let him free and all this. So it's like the heroic DNA. So originally the DNA is stuck in your tissues, can't move. And then it gets to the point where it can swim to another organ. So the DNA swims from your breast to your liver and your brain because it wants to be free. And then in an act of heroism, it starts to fly, and it flies all over the world, and that's called a virus. And it's just a badass story.
Well, I'm glad that you're doing your dangest to correct all this and get the word out about, what's truthfully happening in the human
Yeah.
body. And once you understand that, you can, do your best with the healing modalities. But tell us where we can find more about you and a little bit about Dr. Cowan's garden. I'd love for people to know about that, and then we'll close out.
I mean, the main thing for this is so we have a drtomcowan.com, I guess, and we have a clinic, online clinic called the New Biology Clinic, and we have a curriculum study, which is the curriculum for in the New Biology curriculum. And a lot of the things that we talk about, how to structure your water, we carry as products on either Dr. Tom Cowan or Dr. Cowan's Garden as food. So, we're committed to not just me hassling people and talking and saying, oh, we got this all wrong, but actually putting it into practice. Like, here's how you can learn about this. Here's what you can do about it. Because we've been sold a bill of goods. The medicine we have today is not even medicine. It's a psyop, basically.
Blocking
So,
something in the body
yeah,
that's not meant to be blocked.
exactly.
Well, thank you for your time today. I'm sure people
Okay.
are having a lot to think about right now. And maybe, I'd love to have you on for a follow-up because we have lots of other books we could discuss too. But thanks so much for the work that you're doing. And just keep plugging along, and people are sick of being sick and looking
Yeah.
for,
Good.
how
Okay.
to actually get to the root cause of why they're ill. So thanks for
All
being on.
right. Thank you.